Okay, so we are on Daf. Where are we, Alexi?
Tet
Daf
Amud Bet. So we're in
Bava
the middle of
Metzia.
Tet Amud Bet in Bava Metzia, and we are picking up with our first new Mishnah since we began the parak. I mean, technically, the Mishnah that we have at the beginning of our parak in the Mishnayot is two Mishnayot, but as it appears in our Gemara, this is our first new Mishnah, and as is also often the case with Prakim, like the Mishnayot sort of speed up a bit as you go further. So we just spent a very long time on the past Mishnah, and we will spend 2 weeks on this one because it is much more concise. And in some ways, we're shifting from the paradigm that we've been in for the last however many months, because the main focus of this is not chalukah, but it's dispute, right? It's still about sort of acquisition and competing, not so much competing claims as competing desires and attempts to acquire something, right? And so in some ways, this is a more intuitive continuation of what we've seen in the last daf or so about the animals, right? So we get more into the world of Metzias, we get a lot of moving parts. And like I was saying before the recording began, we have a couple, the sugya is fun, but it's also very strange because there's a few terms that are familiar from the recent dapim, but that are in fact not used the way they were in past. Rashi is very helpful in clarifying some of that, but it's something that we'll try and keep an eye out for. And also, just to put it out now, the sugya that we will be doing next week, picking up with Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda, gives the rationale behind those who think hamagbi mitzila chavero lo kana chavero. But for this week, we're gonna just we're gonna accept that that's a position. We're gonna not get deep into Tofes the Balchov, and then next week we will have all those exciting discussions. Okay, that being said, let's start off with our Mishnah. So, Alish, you want to read?
I can read. מתניתין, היה רוכב על גבי בהמה וראה את המציאה, ואמר לחברו, תנה לי נטלה, ואמר אני זכיתי בה, זכה בה. אם מי שנתנה לו אמר אני זכיתי בה תחילה, לא אמר כלום. So somebody is riding on the behema and he sees an object and he says to his friend, like, pick it up for me. And he says, and if he says, I acquire it, if the one who picks it from the ground says, I acquire it for myself, like I acquired it, okay, so then it's his. And if he's like, after he gives it to the person on the behema, he gives it to the person first, and then he says, but I acquired it initially, so it's as if he didn't say anything, like it belongs to the guy on the behema.
Great. So yeah, Rav Joel and I are passing, walking along. I'm on my very tall horse that I don't want to dismount from, and I just see an entire beautiful set of like rare Sfarim hanging out on the side of the road. And I'm like, Rav Joel, it'd be so wonderful of you to go and get those for me. But Rav Joel picks them up, and he's like maybe initially intending to pick them up for me. Who's to say? And as he's walking over, he's looking at it. He's like, these are actually really beautiful Sfarim. I think I would actually like these to be my Sfarim. And he says that he's successful. Shkoyach, they're now his. But if he hands them over to me and then says, oh, he'd just been like giving them to me for safekeeping, but he had actually intended to pick them up for himself, that's meaningless. These are now mine. So Rashi is going to get into why the latter thing is true. So Alish, do you want to continue with the Rashi, Lo Amar Klum?
Okay. לא אמר כלום. דאפילו אמרינן המגביה מציע לחברו לא קנה חברו. כיוון דהבה לקניה. ממה נפשך? Okay, so I'll stop here. Even if we say that the one who picks a metzia for his friend, so he is not acquiring for the friend, because when he gives it to him, so he acquired it, like in Manavshach is like either way, right? Like either way. So if I didn't read. Okay. קניה כמה דלה מתכוון להקנות לחברו, היהבה נהלי במתנה. Okay, so the first case is if he acquired it first because he didn't intend to give it to his friend. So
Kama is like the person, right? If the first person acquired it, right? The one who picks it up.
Okay. So if the first person acquired it and he didn't intend to give it to his friend, so when he gave it to him, so it's as if he gave it b'matana.
Right, it's a gift.
It's a gift, therefore it belongs to him. Then ve'ila kaniyei kama mishum delahava mitkaven le'aknot, and if he didn't acquire it because he didn't intend to be the makna for his friend, havialei hefker ad demata leadei. So it was hefker; it didn't belong to anybody until it reached the hands of the person on the behema.
Right, lidei dehai until
lidei dehai. Okay, I saw it. Lidei dehai. And the other one acquired it b'mai de akra midei de kama leshem kniya, because he uprooted it, took it from the hands of the first guy leshem kinyan.
Great. So okay, it's an interesting Rashi because it's not like so immediately clear why he feels the need to tell us some of this. Right. First of all, he's already sort of doing one of those spoilers where he's already letting us in on the fact that the framework of 9b-10a will be relevant in this sugya, right? We'll see that's the way one of our two Amoraim explained the Mishnah. But he says, even within the Rav Nachman framework, right, where we say 9b-10a lo kana chavero, still, no matter what, once Rav Joel has given me those farim, they're mine, right? Because either we say that he did properly acquire them for himself when he picked it up, so that he gave them to me, and our assumption is that's a gift. Or when he picked them up, he wasn't intending to acquire them for himself, and so he didn't acquire them for himself, and so they're just hefker. And then I did hagba, and they're mine, right? So one way or another, once they're in my hands, if he said nothing before, he no longer has the ability to protest. Now, I think I don't think any of the sources they gave gets deeply into this. Some people say Rashi is basing this off a dispute between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet that shows up elsewhere. Alish, do you have I know we have different editions for some people. Do you have the Hagahot B'Tzionim next to Dolomit Kaven in that Rashi?
Oh, I'm online, but
does anybody else have the Hagahot B'Tzionim, a little Dalid, or maybe it's also different numbering in some? Michael, I saw a thumbs up. Do you want to read what it says?
Yeah. Tivyat Bilomit Kaven. Vileta lahaknot lechavira.
Okay.
Right. So then the Rashi, where did the Rashi go? Right. I kanya kama bilomit kaven hayavanila. Right. Like without intention, or without like thinking about giving it to the other person.
What's the vileta lahaknot lechaviro mean in this note?
That it's not there.
Right. So he just says below meets kaven.
Right. That he's just like doing it kind of. I read this as kind of mindlessly picking it up.
Right. Or meaning like nominally, he is not intending to acquire it for himself, is the main thing, right? So there's a dispute between Rav Sheshet and Rav Nachman, because part of what makes that girsa make more sense is that since Rashi is saying this mima nafshach within the framework of Bava Metzia lechavero kana chavero, it's weird to say, oh, the guy acquired it because he didn't intend to acquire it for his friend, even if he did intend to acquire it for his friend. No, right? Like our Rav Nachman's whole explanation is that he was intending to do that and then he changed his mind, right? But maybe both of these are talking about he was intending to acquire it for his friend, or at least he wasn't dafka intending for himself. In that case, Rav Sheshet and Rav Nachman have a disagreement. right? Rav Nachman says, if Joel picks up those Sfarim for me, it doesn't work. I don't acquire them. And also because he was not intending to acquire them for himself, those Sfarim remain hefker, right? Again, until they get into my hands and I properly pick them up, intending for them to be mine. Whereas Rav Sheshet says, if Rav Joel picks up those Sfarim for me, not only do I not acquire them, but Joel does acquire them. Because like he did Hagba. And he was intending to do an active acquisition, granted not for himself. Rav Sheshet says it works anyway. Right? So some of the commentators on Rashi think that that's the dispute he's kind of mapping out in this Mima Nafsha.
I mean, it also feels in a different case similar. I'm not recalling all of the details so well right now, but like the sugya that we saw earlier, where you have this case where two people have both grabbed onto a Metzia, but like where neither of them like has outright possession, and we have this case of another person coming and grabbing it, where we say Shabir Chata, right? Like there is still this period where something is in someone's possession, but still considered hefker in a way that feels like it could be a separate parallel for this case.
Right. The idea of like, we've seen the idea of people picking things up in various ways that nonetheless do not affect acquisition such that they now own it. Rav Joel?
No, I think there's also like just an interesting thing about whether or not an active kinyan requires kavanah or not, right? Is it like if I do an active kinyan, am I automatically kone, or like maybe this is obvious to everybody, but I'm just playing this out, right? Or do I actually have to like be like I wanted to be kone, and I don't necessarily have to say anything out loud, but I have to like have an intention in my head. So
right, of course, there's a couple levels to this, right? There's and it's not totally clear which of these Rashi is operating on, but there's both the question you just pointed out, which is like, do I have to have kavanah for myself? Or if I just, as Michael was saying earlier, kind of mindlessly pick it up, do I still acquire it because I did that physical act? Or actually, when I'm even intending to acquire it for somebody else, if we say that doesn't work, is my active acquisition so powerful that like not only does it not work for the other person, but default, since I was intending to do an acquisitory act of picking it up, it accrues to me? Or do we say, no, like arguably you could imagine someone who would say that if you picked it up without any kavanah whatsoever, that it's yours, might still argue if you picked it up for somebody else that it's not yours. She said that wasn't your intent, right? What, like you were trying to get something for somebody else and now we say, whoops, like congratulations on your new shas, like, So it's an interesting little dispute that Rashi kind of funnels in here. He's kind of already giving us, as he often does, a peek at some of the disputes coming up later in the Gemara. Any more questions or comments on that before we plunge into Peah? All right. Sarah, do you want to read the beginning of our Gemara?
Sure. Tnan hata mishali kate tapea va'amar harezo leploni ani Rabbi Eliezer omer zakalo hachamim omrim yitnena la'ani shanim tzarishon. Okay, so we have a breita in Peah. It says if you're collecting Peah and you say this Peah is for this particular poor person, Rabbi Eliezer says that works. Joel, were there just balloons in your Zoom screen?
Sometimes there are movements you can do that release balloons. I discovered this recently.
Okay. Seemed like there were balloons.
I had no kavanah for balloons, but it may have happened.
Okay. Balloons don't require kavanah, as it turns out. All right, sorry, it was just a little distracting. Okay, great. So Rabbi Eliezer says that if you say this Peah is for this particular poor person, that's effective. But Hachamim say that it doesn't work, and you have to give the Peah to whichever poor person you encounter first, so you don't get to choose.
Right. Like I have a friend who is currently bedridden, but she needs food, and like she's someone who would qualify for Peah. She just can't collect it herself. So I go out and collect for her. I say, this is for my friend Jody. Rabbi Eliezer says, that works, it's hers. The Chachamim say it doesn't work. Now we're going to see an interesting qualification of Rashi on this. Look at the Rashi on Mishali Ketz Peah.
Okay, Mishali Ketz Peah. Adam be'alma she'enu bal sadeh. De'i be'bal sadeh lo amar Rabbi Eliezer zakah deleka lememar migo dezache lenafshe filu hu ani mehuzar hu shalo laket Peah misadeh shalo. Kid Amar Bishchitat Hulin, Lo Telakait La'ani Lehizaher Oni Al Shalo. Okay, so this has to be talking about a general person and not particularly about the owner of the field, because we know in general that that Rabbi Eliezer wouldn't be able to say that this statement would work because there's a general principle that you can't collect payah for yourself even if you're poor.
Right. But like
From your own field, to be clear.
exactly. Right. You're qualified is the wrong word. You I guess meet the qualifications.
Yeah.
Right? For collecting payah elsewhere, but no matter what, you can't collect payah from your own field, which I think makes some intuitive sense, right? Because like the ability to collect payah from one's field basically negates the whole idea of payah. Even if, again, we are talking about a person who nonetheless does need that support. So he says,
seems like it depends on what you think the purpose of payah is, right? If you think the purpose of payah is just economic redistribution, then maybe you say, oh, it's really efficient, actually. This poor person just takes their payah. If you think the purpose of payah is some kind of, I don't know, moral training, right? Or building certain kinds of social connections across class or whatever, then like this isn't going to work. But
right. I think there's also a low plug logic a little, right? I mean, like you could have a more formalist approach of like, it's exeret katuv, you can't do it. Shkoyach, like if you're the Baal HaSaga, you don't get it. But I think from a logic of like, why would we discourage even an ani collecting their own payah? Right, that even if, as you said, from like the logic of just we want to support people economically, that should make perfect sense. If there are some people who basically don't have to leave payah from their fields, they just go and collect it, and it looks like they're just harvesting their whole field. Arguably, that could like threaten the norm of what it means to keep payah, that we have like both like Maris Ayin and in general, just like, okay, if we think it's general good for payah to exist, having some people not keep it, even though really they're in fact just collecting their own payah, potentially threatens the integrity of the system.
Or it makes that, and I think the other thing is that it can be embarrassing, right? Because now I've announced to everyone how poor I am.
Right, like it's bad either way. Either people don't know that I'm so poor, and then they're like, that person's not keeping payah, maybe I don't have to keep payah, or they think I'm a Russia, or they like see that and they're like, oh, that must be a poor person. Like this is the only land that he owns. How embarrassing. So in any case, Rashi thinks this is the case. Important to note that most Rishonim disagree with him. Most of them think that an ani can collect payah from their own field. Rav Joel?
But I was saying in the first parak of Gittin, this is like they force Rebbe in like a particular reading. They force Rebbe Eliezer into this drasha, right? So it's like you don't have to. It's not necessarily universal to assume that. And so I was just like, it seems to be a lone opinion there.
So it's interesting that Rashi feels the need to bring this in, and I want to loop back to it once we've read a little bit more about the Gemara, because I think that why he brings this maybe connects to some of the logics we'll get following up. So back to our Gemara, we quoted the Mishnah, and now we'll get some Amoraic analysis. So do you want to keep reading, Sarah?
Sure. Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Machloket me'ashir l'ani. The Rabbi Eliezer Savar migo de'ibai mifaker nichnase have ani v'chazilei hashta nami chazilei umigo dezachi l'nafshe zachi nami l'chavrei. Okay. The Rabbanan Savrei chad migo amrinan trei migo lo amrinan. Okay, let's stop there. Maybe
you can read that, Val. I think it's.
Do you want to keep going? Okay, aval me'ani la'ani divrei kol zacha. Zachalo migo de zache lenafshe zachi nami lechavri. Okay.
Great.
So Ula says that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that the machloket here is about a rich person collecting payah for a poor person. And in which case Rabbi Eliezer thinks that I'm trying to remember which way this goes around. I had this in my head yesterday and now I don't. Someone help me out here. I'm just like got myself confused.
Word-wise, right? Ibai mafkir nichse.
Rav Eliezer believes you can do two migos.
We'll get in,
Right.
we'll get into there, but first, just like, what is the first thing you would need to do?
He could renounce all of his
He
property.
he could renounce everything, and then that would kind of effectuate it. Yeah.
Right. I'm collecting for my friend. I personally currently am not poor enough to qualify for Paya, but if I wanted, I could in this moment declare all of my property ownerless, and then I would be poor enough to collect Paya. That is within my power to become a person who is able to collect Paya. Right. And since that's true, and like it would be possible for a Paya to be like suitable for me, right? Then what do we say? Hashtanami.
Yeah, and then here too he can collect. So it's not, I mean, I think that the underlying intuition is something like, well, it's not like there are kinds of people who can collect Paya. It's about circumstance. So if he can put himself into that circumstance, that's good enough.
Exactly, right? And so then what's the principle that then follows? Because I could put myself in that circumstance, why am I able to collect for my friend?
Because if I could collect for myself, then I'm allowed to collect for whatever.
Yeah.
The phrase is being used slightly differently, right? But like, because I can collect for myself, I can, or acquire for myself, I can acquire for somebody else.
Exactly. In a scenario where I would be able to acquire this for myself, I have the power to acquire it totally for someone else, right? And so, fine, that's what Rabbi Eliezer holds. Why do the Rabbanan not hold that way?
Because they don't want to do two migos at once.
Correct.
Or chained to one another.
Yeah, which, as Rav Joel pointed out at the beginning of this class, confusingly, we've said this principle of tre migo lo amrinan elsewhere, but usually it has a different meaning. These are not formal migos, right? What is a normal migo when we mean it in the formal sense? Michael?
Like, you are believed because you could have made a worse claim if you were lying.
Exactly, right? That like you could have made a more advantageous claim. And so from the fact that you didn't, we assume that you're telling the truth, because otherwise, why wouldn't you have made that claim? Fine. And so we say that we don't layer those assumptions. I'm trying to remember, like, what was the case that you were referring to?
This was, I think, a third type of migo. That was the case of the cheresh and the pikeach, who both picked something up, and their migo doesn't mean because you have potential.
Oh yeah, that was also actually a mitoch, I would say.
Yeah, that was because I am acquiring it, I can acquire it for somebody else, right? That was like a third type, right? Where we've got the one Michael's talking about, which is the legal case. We've got these, which is because I have the potential to do something, therefore it's as if I do it. And then we had a third case was the Rava against Rami Bar Chama, which was, since I'm already doing it for myself, I can include somebody else in my action, essentially. So
right, and there, I don't want to delve deep into that sugya,
Yeah.
but there is like, yeah, I agree it's being used a little differently. In all these cases, there's a notion, the similarity is a notion of like layering, right? Like a reluctance to like, we already have a sort of like assumption that requires one leap, right? Like we're willing to do one leap, we're not willing to do two, right? And so I think these different migos are being used in different ways when it comes to what that leap is, right? And the more formal, typical quote unquote migo of believability, right? That's the leap we're making of like, we trust you because you could have made this better claim, even though you're not, right? And here it's really just like mitoch sheh, from the fact that you could have acquired it for yourself, you're able to acquire it for somebody else. And Rabbi Eliezer is like, we can stack them. From the fact that you could have become someone who could acquire it for yourself, you can acquire it for somebody else. Sarah?
Yeah, I think there's a way in which the use here is kind of interestingly more parallel to the kind of technical legal case than to the place where it's really the same language in, I don't know, a couple of Debima go with the Charish, because here there is a claim that he could have made, which is I'm qualified for Paya, but he doesn't make that, like he doesn't actually have to say that, but he could say it, and the fact that he could say it is enough to kind of get us going, which seems sort of interestingly similar to like he could have admitted to something much bigger, but he didn't.
Right. I think there's almost also like when it comes to the you could have blank, there is an element if it's like a case where you can acquire it for yourself, like you have the ability, but it's like theoretically you could have like acquired that for yourself and then given it to the other person, right? Like it is within your, like later, like given it to them as a matana, right? So it is like within your power to like directly, like through another step, make that transfer. And because you could have done that, we allow you to skip the intermediate step and just immediately acquire it for the other person, right? And I think what you were saying earlier, again, like about the Rabbi Eliezer's willingness to collapse the Ashir and Oni thing because you could become an Oni, right? In contrast to like Maaser, right? Maaser Rishon. If I am a male Yisrael, I cannot acquire Maaser for my Levi friend because I will never be a person. There is no way in which I can become a person who would be able to get that for myself, right? There is no step. It is not within my power to do anything that would suddenly make me a Maaser eligible person. Whereas for Peah, anybody who has property is within their ability to become a person who could acquire Peah, right? And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says we can collapse that step, and the Rabbanan say, actually, no, that's too many theoreticals. We're only willing to do one, right? And so in the case of that Asher to Ani, since the Asher currently can't acquire the Peah for himself, he can't acquire it for the poor person. But what do they all agree upon? Sarah or anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, they all agree about a case where there's two poor people.
Exactly. Ula says, in a case where the person currently has the ability to have acquired this for themselves, the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer, everyone would say they're able to acquire it for their fellow. Right? So that is his presentation of the Mishnah and Peah. But Rav Nachman does not like it. Any questions on Ula before we plunge forward with Rav Nachman? All right. Michael, do you want to read
Wait, I think
the
Noam-
Amar Le Rav Nachman? Oh, no,
Well, I was just thinking about it. Like, we could read this as like a really weird, like formalist argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim about like whether or not you can stack two migos, or like we don't have to go that route, and we could just say Rabbi Eliezer has these two premises, and Chachamim just happen to have one of those two. Like, I don't know, maybe that's what everyone was thinking, but
yeah, like I think that again, there's both like with a lot of these things, this is often the case. There is like a formalist way you can present it of like this rule we don't go by. And this one says, I'm fine with that rule. But also just like, yeah, like what intuitively, what are they comfortable with? Being like, okay, I feel like it is like an automatic, it's such a close jump that we can collapse those steps, is Rabbi Eliezer's intuition. And the Chachamim say like, no, there's actually just like for a stable legal system, we think that like to distance the theoreticals too much is like not really particularly ideal, right? Like there's only so many steps out that we're willing to go. Okay. So, Michael, do you want to pick up with Amar Le Rav Nachman the Ula?
Yeah. Amar le Rav Nachman le'ula. V'leimamar me'ani le'ani machloket. Deha Metzia hakol ani etzla. Right? So Rav Nachman said in response to Ula, right, that you could say that there is also a machloket when transferring from ani to ani, because when it comes to this found object, everyone is poor in relation to that. Like no one has it yet.
Well, not no one has it, right? But also look at the Rashi on Hakol Ani Metzla.
Deha Metzia hakol ani etzla kilomar hakol ksherim l'zakot ba ka'aniyim b'peah. Right, that like the same way that any ani can take peah, so too this object is hefker, like it's open for anyone to take.
Exactly, right? That like the case of me trying to me trying to acquire a Metzia for my friend is equivalent to the Ma'ani La'ani, because I could have acquired a Metzia for myself, right? Utnan.
One second, just there it goes. Okay, utnan hayarochev right. Utnan hayarochev utnan hayarochev al gabe behema verha'at hametzia v'amar lechaviro tnali natla ve'amar ani zachiti ba zachava. Right. So and we have our Mishnah, which is a case of one person riding and asking his friend to pick up the object for him, and the friend picks up the object and says, I've acquired it, that he acquires it. The friend acquired.
So now we'll look at Rashi is very helpful in this section in like playing out our assumptions. So look at the Rashi on Utnan.
Utnan hamagbiya metzia lechavero lo kana chavero v'lo amrinan migo de'i hava ba'e hava zache lenavshe zache nami lechabre ki magbala kula l'shem chavero ditnan haya rochev v'chulei. So this right, it's taught basically that one who, right, in this case, one who lifts up a found object for his fellow, that friend does not acquire the object. And we don't say in this case the migo that like if he wanted, he could have gotten it for himself. And that therefore his fellow also acquires it.
In a case where kimag bala kula l'shem chavero.
In a case where he like picked up the thing entirely for the sake of giving it to his friend. Where, right, because it's taught haya rochev al gabei behema, right? Like we know that there's this case where we're not going to say that because, right, we're not going to treat these two actors as interchangeable and just say like, well, if you can acquire it for yourself, you can acquire it for your friend, and if your friend can acquire it for himself, then he can acquire it for you, right? Like the person, it actually matters who is picking up the object. It gives, in the case of our Mishnah, the person who picks it up the ability to lay a claim to the object, despite the fact that like the person on the behema was the one who actually kind of called out and said something verbally first.
Correct. So now Rashi is going to help us sort of narrate the Mishnah according to Rav Nachman's assumption. So look at the Amar Ani Zachiti Ba.
The Amar Ani Zachiti Ba. Kasal kadatach ani rodze lazakot ba achshav kamar. Umodehu shemitchila higbia l'shem chavero v'katane zachava alma lo kana chavero. Right. So lest you think that what,
or not lest you think. What's kasal kadatach?
like it should arise in your mind.
Yeah, that this is like Rashi usually uses at the beginning to be like, this is how you're supposed to understand things at this stage in the Gemara, right? Or here he's like, according to Rav Nachman, right? To follow Rav Nachman, this is how you have to understand things.
Okay. So you should understand Rav Nachman as basically, right, that the guy on the ground is saying, right, I would now like to, right, in this moment, I would like to acquire this object. I am now kind of, it is now occurring to me for the first time that maybe I would like the shas.
Exactly.
And in that process, he acknowledges that at first, when he actually lifted the object, he was lifting it for the sake of his peer, the person who was rochev al gabei behema, right? And in that case, it is taught that he acquires it, such that his fellow does not.
Right. But Rav Nachman is saying, here's how we narrate our Mishnah. Like, yeah, when I told Rav Joel to go pick up those Sfarim, he was doing what I asked. He was like, the intuitive thing, our assumption is that he was picking them up for me. And then like, yeah, he was walking over, he looked at them, he's like, actually, these are really nice. I'm taking them for myself. Sorry. Right. And he's only able to do that if we say that when he first picked them up for me, it didn't work. Right. So seemingly hamagbiya metzia lechavero lo kana chavero.
Right.
But now
until the point that it actually gets to chavero's possession.
Correct. Right. And so now this next Rashi is really great because he's helping untangle the way these terms are being used
Can you just-
here.
Can you just explain if he would have lifted, if kana Metzia lechavero, sorry, Magbia Metzia lechavero kana chavero, why would the mission not make sense?
Because if, again, we have to have a couple assumptions. If we understand the Mishnah the way Rav Nachman is understanding it, that means that Joel initially was picking up those books for me, right? That like the guy on the ground initially picked them up for the rider. And so if we say Hamagbi Metzia lechavero kana chavero, then those books are mine as soon as he picks them up. He doesn't have the ability. If somebody carries around books, like I have a bookshelf right here, if a guest came, carried around my shelf and was like, actually, I would like this to be mine now. That's not theirs. I haven't given it to them. It's mine, right? Like Joel wouldn't have the ability to change his mind if they were already mine as soon as he picked it up, right? From the fact that he can say as he's walking over, actually, these are mine, it must be that they were still hefker, despite the fact that he'd intended to pick them up for me.
Great.
Okay. So now Rashi is going to help us sort of, clarify the way these terms are being used here versus how we saw them back on Chet Amud Aleph. So Jess, do you want to read the Iyamart Bish, or actually, sorry, we have to continue in the Gemara. So do you want to pick up in the Gemara with Iyamart Bishlema?
Sure. Okay. Iyamart Bishlema me'ani le'ani machloket matnisin mani. Rabbanan hi ala Iyamart ba'asher va'ani machloket about me'ani le'ani divrei hakol zachala ha'amani lo Rabbanan v'lo Rabbi Eliezer.
Great.
Amale matni.
Or
Okay. Yeah.
pause before.
Great. Okay. So if you say that the case in the Mishnah is when the person who's in the Mishnah pair, that the person who's getting payer is also poor and qualified for payer, if that's how you're mapping it onto our original Mishnah Bava Kama, then who is our Mishnah Bava Kama in accordance with? It would be in accordance with the Rabbanan, because it's suggesting that you can't acquire it.
Right. The Mishnah, if the Mishnah in Peah is about Me'ani La'ani, then the Rabbanan believe that even when you could have acquired something for yourself, when you pick it up for your fellow, it doesn't work. Right. And so then they would be the opinion reflected in our Mishnah here. But
if you say that the case is an Ashirin and Ani, then our Mishnah doesn't seem to really map onto anyone, because it's not Rabbanan's opinion, because they would say that that person doesn't get it, and it's also not Rabbi Eliezer's opinion.
right, that according to Ula, everyone thinks that in a scenario where you could have gotten something for yourself, you're able to acquire it totally for somebody else. And if that's true, then if our Mishnah here is referring to a case where Joel picks up those Sfarim for me, whose opinion says that he can then change his mind? It's nobody, right? And there's a couple commentators who point out that theoretically you could say, there's a third secret opinion that is neither of them. But the assumption is that if there were an opinion that disagreed with them, it would be recorded in Peah, right? Like if that was not the full spectrum of the machloket, we would get the other one, right? So it seems like these are the opinions, and if they don't map onto our Mishnah, we have a problem, right? So now let's look at the Rashi on the bottom of Talmud Bet, the Iyamart Bishlema.
Iyamart Bishlema me'ani le'ani machloket de'amram Rabbanan lo amrinan migo de'zachin nafshe zachina milachavere. Ella hecha de'hagbia ledat shnehem כגון שניים שהגביהו מציע דאמר בה לעיל, בזמן שהם מודים חולקים בלא שבועה. דתמה משום מיגל דזכה בהגבהה זו לנפשי זכינה מן החברי, אבל מיגל דאי בי הווה זכי לנפשי זכי לחברי, לא אמרינן.
Okay.
Okay. So Rabbanan said that we don't hold by the migo, that if you can acquire for yourself, you can also acquire for someone else, except in a case where you pick it up with the consent or knowledge, or however we were translating that today, of both of them, like when two people pick up a Metzia, as we saw in Daf Chet, and that's the case where they both agree to divide it without a shvua, because the principle of Zachil, because the one who merits with the picking up for himself will also merit for his friend.
Right, that he actually is acquiring it for himself. He can acquire it also for his friend, right?
Yeah.
What's just like, you've already translated, but just like spell out for me in your own words, the difference between how Rava uses this term and how Ula uses this term.
So, and when you say the term, you mean the migo, or you mean?
The migo de zache lenafshe zache nami lechabre.
So Ula seems to think it just kind of works across the, like, sorry, I'm having trouble putting it into words.
Right, Rashi, I think, is helpful saying migo de I have a bae have zache lenafshe. So that's actually what Ula is saying, which means what?
Like, if he had wanted to acquire it for himself.
Exactly. From the fact that like you have the ability to have acquired it for yourself if you wanted
Therefore,
to.
I got tripped up on defining migo.
Yeah. You can acquire it entirely for someone else.
Yes.
Whereas how did Rava use it?
Rava's
Sorry, I'm blanking. Where did Rava come up again?
Yeah,
Rava, this is what he's referencing. Sorry, this is a helpful refresher. Back on Chet Amud Aleph.
Oh, you mean on Chet?
Right. So that's what Rashi is referencing here.
So that was the on Chet Amud Aleph we were using the non-technical legal definition of miga.
Well, I mean, it's non-technical here either, in the sense of
it's like not the.
And that was what Joel was saying. Either in both of these cases, it's not the like migo.
But we were
migo.
On
probably remind ourselves
just
of
meaning just like because basically.
But what the machloket is between Rami Bar Chama and Rava.
Right.
That's
so
what we're talking about.
The phrasing that they used is Rami Bar Chama said, "Bava Metzia lechavero kana chavero," right? And he proved that principle from our original Mishna of the two people picking up a Metzia, of like, if my principle weren't true, neither of them should have acquired it. And Rava said in that case, they do both acquire it, it's worked, but because of migo de zache lenafshe zache nami lechabre. Sarah, what does he mean by that?
He's using it as meaning.
Oh, go ahead, Jess.
Sorry. Just that because they are both in partnership in this picking up action, they can acquire it.
Exactly, that because he is actually acquiring it for himself, he is able to also acquire it for somebody else, right? That like essentially the very confusing thing here is that Ula's principle, the way Ula uses migo de zache lenafshe, is in fact equivalent to Rami Bar Chama, right? The way Ula uses this term is hamagbia metzia lechavero kana chavero, right? That in a case where you could have gotten something for yourself, you can acquire it entirely for another person, right? And Rav Nachman is arguing that like the Rabbanan don't hold that way, right? The Rabbanan holds like Rava, the way Rava uses that term, right? Which is that if like, we have to say that everyone agrees on this principle because otherwise our first Mishnah doesn't make sense, right? So everyone agrees that if you're actually acquiring something for yourself, you can also acquire for somebody else. But the Rabbanan don't think that the possibility to have done it for yourself enables you to do it entirely for somebody else. Okay. That is, the understanding. Rashi is helping us understand how these terms are used here. That's Rav Nachman's understanding of our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah, the principle of 9b-10a l'chavero kana chavero is at play because Joel initially picked up those books for me, and he says the Rabbanan opinion is that that doesn't work. Since he was only trying to acquire them for me, another person, it's ineffective, and he's able to change his mind and acquire. So any questions on that before we look at another funky Rashi? Okay. So Rashi on the top of the next Amud is important understanding, I think, the why people are compelled to make different explanations of these Mishnayot. So just, do you want to read the Rashi of Maniti and Rabbanan here?
Sure. Matnitin Rabbanan he Vashmu'inan Resha the Hechat Zache Be Yuha Amrinan Miga the Sefer Ashmu'inan the Hechat La Zache Be Ihu Miga the Ibai Zache La Amrinan. So we teach in the Resha of the Mishnah.
Right, or the Resha is
meaning
teaching
like
us
the original Mishnah.
Exactly, the 2a Mishnah.
That in a case where he merits it, we would say Miga. And in the Sefer of that Mishnah, we teach that where he doesn't merit it, the Miga is like, we wouldn't say if he wanted to acquire it, he could acquire it for himself.
Right, that we basically, according to the Rav Nachman understanding of the Mahalach of our Mishnayot, right, we start off by teaching people that when two people lift something together, they can acquire for themselves and the other, right? That's what our first Mishnah taught us. And then this Mishnah follows that up by being like, however, if you try to only acquire for somebody else, it doesn't work, right? And so that's like why we need both of these. But the implicit challenge against Ula is like, if actually everyone agrees that you can acquire something entirely for somebody else, then one of these is extraneous, right? Like if I would learn from this Mishnah, like if I actually think that I'm Bava Metzia l'chavero kana chavero, what's the chiddush in one of these? Right? That like according to Rav Nachman, we have a reason why each of these needs to be taught. And according to Ula, it's like, they're like, yeah, Pshita that wouldn't work. Or Pshita that does. So I think there are some Rishonim who explain how Ula would articulate his chiddush. But I think it's a reasonable explanation of like, why does Rav Nachman find this compelling? In addition to, we'll see next week, like I said, a more local logic of why does he think Bava Metzia l'chavero kana chavero not make sense? But also from the sort of vantage point of explaining our Mishnayot and like a non-extraneousness. He's like, yeah, this way each of them is teaching something new. Okay. But nonetheless, Ula is able to defend himself because the way Rav Nachman narrated our Mishnah is not the only possible way. So Noam, do you want to pick up in the Gemara with the Amar Le?
Sure, even though this is the part of the sugya where my understanding broke down, but okay. But I'll go try. Sorry, I just lost my place actually. Velo Rabbi Eliezer. Amar le matnitin the Amar Tchila. Okay, so Ula responds that actually when the picker-upper said the words in the Mishnah, Ani zachiti ba, they said it like either right before or simultaneous with the act of picking up.
So you've arrived at a machloket of Rinu Hananel and Rashi. Look at the Rashi.
Oh, I read both and was like, really got whiplash. So
let's look at the Rashi on the Amar Tchila.
Okay. The Amar Tchila, hi, Ani zachiti ba. The Amar Tchila, Hi, ani zachiti ba'adamar tchila kamar le, mitchila hagbahatiha letzorchi, velo letzorchacha, ve'leolam ha'magbia metzia lechavero kana chavero, dumya deme'ani lani. So I could translate these words, ani zachiti ba, when they were said at the very outset.
He's saying tchila.
Oh, the kamar. Tchila kamar.
Right? Now Rashi expands. What does that mean?
From when I picked it up.
Yeah, from the beginning. Mitchila.
From the beginning, when I picked it up, I did so for my sake, not for your sake. And so actually, one who picks up an object for their fellow, the fellow does actually acquire it, which explains how ani le'ani remains a machleket between Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim.
No, why ani la'ani would not be a machloket, right? According to Ula, everyone agrees that ma'ani la'ani would work, right? Because that's again the equivalent.
Yeah, I got confused. Yes.
Yeah. So Ula says, Rav Nachman, you narrated the Mishnah wrong. You said what happened is Rav Joel dutifully went and picked up the Sfarim for me, looks at them as he's walking over, changes his mind, says, I want to acquire them now. If that's the mahalach, then clearly he did not effectively acquire them for me when he first picked it up. But Ula says, no, when Rav Joel, halfway to walking over to me, it says, these are mine. What he's saying is, actually from the get-go, sorry that you asked for these, but I saw them, they looked nice, I picked them up for myself from the beginning. I never intended to acquire these for you, right? That in that case, right, it seems like potentially the Chiddush was like, you might have said, oh, because he went to go pick them up after me asking, and he didn't say anything while picking them up, you might have thought that we don't believe him, right? And so this teaches us that we do, right? That like, if he hasn't given them to me yet, we believe him to say, yeah, like, actually, sorry, when I picked them up, it was for me, and so they're mine, right? But that, according to Ula, if that's the sort of narrative going on here, this doesn't necessarily disprove that Hamagbia Metzia Chavero Kana Chavero, right? That if he had intended to pick them up for me, it would have worked. Does that make sense? Or Joel, do you have?
No, I was wondering because I was thinking about the Rabbeinu Hananel Rashi debate here, and I think,
oh yes, Rabbeinu Hananel thinks it's as Noam initially explained it. He says when he first picks it up, these are mine.
Yeah, the reason I was wondering about like Rabbeinu Hananel's logic, and I think from a language point of view, Rashi's wrong. And I'll just like I think maybe someone could tell me. I think it would have to say mi'ikara to follow Rashi, and not mitchila. Tchila sounds like it's like before, like the way that like the way Rabbeinu Hananel explains it, like before I even picked it up, I said, right, this is mine, and then I picked it up, right? That's how Rabbeinu Hananel explains it. Tchila is like just weird as a word here. I think maybe I'm wrong, but it just felt wrong. Ikara sounds better. I think Rashi's right in what it actually means. It's just a weird word choice. So
I think that Rashi makes sense because ani zachiti b'tchila is explicitly also what the person says, like when you give them over to me, when you give me the Sfarim and then try and claim ani zachiti b'tchila, I had already acquired them first. That seems to be like
also, Ikara is really Aramaic, and I think we're trying to say what in Hebrew. In other words, we're trying to be a Mishnaic, and like he's saying, we're using the language at the end of the Mishnah.
Right, which the next bit is about to expand. Again, you could argue that as is about to happen, that can cut either way. But
yeah.
I don't know. I see your point, but I think that Rashi isn't like so dachuk with the language. I also just think most of the other Rishonim go like Rashi because they're like Rabbeinu Hananel doesn't make sense. Like
only makes sense
that if Rav Joel goes, picks up the Sfarim saying, I'm getting these for myself, of course they're his. Like, congrats. Like, what's the finish there?
Well, someone's commanded you, Davka, to like go pick them up for them. Like, so there's like a bit of a weird element
But
in
like,
that.
there is still a weirdness
And they
there.
might have like pointed it out to them, like maybe that person wouldn't have seen it on their own. So it's like different from a normal case.
Wait,
You know.
I also think tchila and the seifa there means, right, I acquired it before I gave it to you. In other words, is the claim, right? As opposed to, here, if you said ani zachiti ba tchila in the reisha, I acquired it before what, right? So it's like,
Before
no,
now.
no, that's what the
That would be
Gemara
the
says.
whole point.
Yeah.
Is that it's a
Yeah, but-
step before when you're currently saying it, right? That like
Well,
when
don't-
I say it, when you say it when it's in my hands, you're saying a step before now I had already acquired this, aka while it was still in my hands. And when you say that while walking, you're saying before this, aka when I picked it up, I acquired it.
No, but
Yeah,
I also think that the techila in the Mishnah is going to be interpreted to mean also that he says techila, that it means techila before he claims that he initially, when he picked it up, wanted it for himself. That's
the way
what it's going to
Rashi
mean
sees it.
consistently.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
going
No,
to
I think that's the way
consistently
Rashi sees it.
mean techila. When I lifted it at that moment, I acquired it for myself. And in the second part of the Mishnah, we're saying that claim is not considered a legitimate claim. He's we don't believe him. Whereas in the Reisha, we do believe him.
No, I think in the Seifa, it doesn't matter if we believe him or not, right? He could say, I acquired it whenever I acquired it. He's like, I owned it for 1,000 years. Once you gave it over to the person,
No, what do you mean? I could give you, no. He's saying when I put it in your hand, I was just letting you look at it. In other words, he's trying to claim that he acquired it. And we're saying, no, you didn't acquire it techila. You're just claiming that retrospectively. But because if you would have, then the fact, like if Lexie gives you put some books in your hand, that doesn't make them yours. If you didn't say this is a matana.
Well, except if I asked for them in the first place, right?
Yes.
Then it seems
That
pretty
the
obvious.
whole what we're teaching here is that in a case where
Exactly.
where the person on the horse had asked for the thing, there's no other statements in between, and they give it over, you're not allowed to claim after doing that, well, actually, I wasn't really giving it to them as they'd asked. It was just for myself. Sarah?
Yeah, I to go back to Joel's question of like before what? Is it possible that the answer to before what is before the guy on the horse said go get them? Is that plausible? Seems weird, but
Well, no,
it's
because he means to say he lifted.
maybe a terrorist to
techila.
Joel's question. I don't know.
I don't think so, because he's saying techila. I lifted it initially for that purpose. He couldn't have. If the guy told him get it, then he hasn't yet walked over there. So how could he say?
I don't know. They're walking along.
Get it. I lifted it.
Maybe they're walking along and he's walking towards it. Then the guy says,
Yeah, but walking towards it is not acquiring it.
yeah, but he
Yeah, I
thinks
think-
that he's even, let's say he's picked it. He's like in the process of picking it up when the guy's like, pick that up for me.
Yeah, but right. I don't think that's
I
the case.
Yeah,
I
I know.
also
I don't,
think
I'm
that
just trying to like play it out.
ultimately, I don't think there's enough kamina of if they noticed it before the person versus at the time of lifting that it's theirs, because Noah made the point of like, oh, the other person told you to, but like a person, even if we understand that as being like shlichut, which we'll get into that conversation in a sec, like you can batel your shlichut, like that's within your ability. Right. So like as long as when I'm saying actually these are mine as I pick it up, I very clearly am not acting as a shaliach for the other person. And I have the ability to do that. Right. And like we've taught that elsewhere. And so if that's what he's saying, according to Rabbeinu Hananel, it's hard to understand what the chiddush is. So most of the Rishonim do side with Rashi that he's arguing that like at the time the guy like while he's walking over says, actually, when I first picked these up, it was for myself. Okay. Now we'll read this just like follow up as to why that might make sense, and then we'll take a break. Noam, do you want to?
Just a sorry question before you go. Just actually a question. Are you saying that he has to say it orally, or he just has to think it?
It seems to be that he has to say it, because otherwise the person could challenge him, according to Ula, of like if he says, these are mine, and the person's like, well, if you pick them up for me, they're mine. Right. So he would, I think, have to clarify.
But he has to claim. No, my question is, does he claim that he said he said out loud, I am taking this for myself, or is he claiming verbally that he thought he's taking it out loud? Obviously, the claim is
I think very much that he thought. Like I think it's that he's claiming that my intent at the beginning was for myself.
exactly.
But he's saying the word tchila, right? Like he's saying,
Yes.
He's saying I zachiti b'rat tchila, exactly.
Yeah, that
He's
at the
speaking,
beginning.
even though I didn't say anything at the time, that's what I was thinking.
Right. So now the Gemara is gonna back up this reading based off of the language of the Seifa.
Yeah. Hachinama mistabra the ketane seifa im mishnat nalo amar ani zachiti batchila lo amar klum tchila beseifa lamali pshita afal gav de lo amar tchila tchila kamar ela lav hakashmalan reisha de amar tchila. Okay, so this is backing up Ula's position, support from the Seifa, because there it says that once the picker-upper has actually handed the object to the writer and says, then, and the picker-upper says, Ani zachiti batchila, that actually doesn't work. It's not the picker-uppers at that point. And the Gemara says, why does it say tchila in the Seifa? It's obvious. Pshita, afal gav de lomar tchila, tchila kamar. Even is it like even if he hadn't said tchila, we would have. What else could he be?
Obviously, if Rav Joel has, if he handed the books to me, he's not saying they're mine now. In your, I'm acquiring them now as they sit in your hands. Pshita, right? Like obviously his claim would be, I acquired them before I gave them to you.
You know, I think that's where the word techila changes its meaning. He's proving that the word techila doesn't mean before I gave it to you. It must mean before I picked it up, I was thinking that it's for myself.
Exactly.
That's the Joel's point. In other words, that the word techila doesn't normally mean that. And here he's proving that in this case, it must mean that.
Correct. I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to read a couple of, Rashi has some good stuff on this, and then we'll finish up our last little Rav Nachman defense, and then look at some fun Rishonim and Achronim. So Rashi says, right, for the Seifa v'chulei, right, itchila de Seifa, midiktane Seifa v'chulei, itchila de Seifa lav mishat hagba kamar, ela ani zachiti itchila kodem shnitati lecha nitkavati lischutba, right? That again, if what I'm saying is Joel saying, before I handed it to you, I had the intent of acquiring these books. Lama li lemitna batchila, shita de afilu lo amar tchila beferush, mistama tchila ka'amar, demi matzi lemimar ani zoch ba'akshav v'halo eno be'ado. So we were just saying, like, shita, he'd be saying that he had acquired it before handing them to me, because like there's no way he could possibly argue that he's acquiring them while they're in my hands, right? So that would have been implicit. He didn't need to say tchila. Elalav hakamashmalan. Rather, is it not teaching us this? Derisha de matnitin diktani zachaba bid amar tchila. Ve'eshma'inan seifa de'im mishnat nala ta'an lo otha ta'ana v'amar ani beti mitchila litzorchi lo amar klum. Degale date kishnat nalo da'adate tahai agba. Okay, so rather, it must be that the Seifa is teaching us that, like, in the Reisha, when it says, like, I am acquiring it, what it means is from the get-go, right? That, like, when I first picked it up, it was mine. And the Chiddush of the Seifa is that even if you make that claim, even if Rav Joel says, after handing them to me, yeah, I picked them up for myself, I acquired them, and now I'm just handing them over to you for like safekeeping, but like they're mine. I picked them up for myself. We don't believe him, right? Because the fact that he handed them over to me without any other kind of articulation makes clear that like he had listed those for me and therefore they're mine, right? the fact that this tchila can't be the immediate step before, that it has to be from the picking up, otherwise it's extraneous, it teaches us that so too, that's what we're dealing with in the Reisha. Again, we'll see that you can make the opposite argument. That will be Rav Nachman's, or the sock puppet of Rav Nachman's suggestion. But for now, we will pause for 5 minutes and reconvene with the Gemara envisioning Rav Nachman's defense, right? That like we just said that the Mishnah seemingly supports Ula's read, right? That like based off the seemingly extraneous tchila in the Seifa, that implies that actually the tchila it's referring to is the very beginning of picking up, and that's what the Reisha is teaching about too. But if the person on the ground had picked it up from the get-go for the person on the behema, it would work, right? But the Idach, Rav Nachman, has a defense. So Alish, do you want to pick up with the Idach?
I can try. Ve'idach Tana Seifa legaleri Reisha. Seifa de Amar Tchila, Reisha de Amar Tchila. So, and the other, Rav Nachman says that the Seifa is here to disclose something about the Reisha. In the Seifa, the case of Seifa is that he said Tchila, right? And the Reisha is that he didn't say Tchila.
Right. That we said.
He acquires it even if he didn't intend to do it. Probably in the is it say or intend to do it in the beginning in the Reisha.
That he did, like, great. That it's teaching us. It's true, right? Like the Rav Nachman sock puppet is saying, like, it's true that like the saying of tchila to mean before I gave it to you would be extraneous, like in and of itself. But the reason it teaches that is to say that, you know, the other ani zachiti ba is not where he's saying tchila. He's saying now, right? As opposed to the claim being made in the Seifa of I acquired this before. The claim being made in the Reisha is I am acquiring this now. But when I first picked it up, it was for you. Rav Joel, it looked like you had something to say. No? Okay, so that's the Rav Nachman defense, right? So like we see, like we don't end definitively on either side based off of this chunk of the sugya, right? Because they can each find a way to explain the Mishnah in accordance with their position, right? So the next chunk will get a little bit more into the logics of each position sort of more broadly. But for now...
You should speak out Rav Nachman's point. In other words, again, what is Rav Nachman's opinion about an ani to an ani? Can you be zoche for someone else?
No, like that you cannot be zoche. Rav Nachman thinks that you cannot be entirely zoche for somebody else, right? Even if you could have been zoche for yourself, you are never able to simply just like pick something up and acquire it entirely for another person, not for yourself at all. Or Joel?
Well, he thinks Rabbi Eliezer thinks you can. Right?
Yes, he thinks Rabbi Eliezer believes that, but that the Rabbanan don't, and therefore he also doesn't.
And what's the significance of the way he reads the Mishnah?
Well, what do you mean by significance? As in the halachic nafkamina is that he thinks this is a support for the idea that Bava Metzia lechavero lo kana chavero.
Fill out what the techila, how he views the techila.
That he thinks the techila is being said in the Seifa, right? As in meaning just a stage before this, right? That like I'm claiming in the Seifa that I acquired this before handing it over, before I am now making this statement. And it teaches that, even though that should be obvious, to clarify that in the Reisha, when he says ani v'chiti ba, he's not saying tchila. He's saying right now I'm acquiring it. But from the get-go, I actually was acquiring it for you. And nonetheless, it works because Bava Metzia lechavero lo kana chavero.
Oh, that's what I wanted. Yeah, that's what I wanted to get to. In other words, even though he's saying I'm acquiring right now, it still works. Why? If he right. Because if he would have said techila, And even if he would say techila, it doesn't matter. No?
Well, yeah, as in that, like, no, it would matter if in the Resha, because everyone would agree, seemingly, that like if he says from the beginning, I lifted this for myself, of course it's his. Right? That the dispute is Ula thinks if he says, I lifted it initially for you and now I'm taking it, that doesn't work. Whereas Rav Nachman thinks that even if you say, no, I initially lifted it for you, but now before handing it over, I've decided I want it, that does work and it's yours.
All right, good.
Okay, so now I'm gonna share screen. Here, these guys. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out whether we want to focus on the Shita Mikubetset or just plunge into Maharsha. Anybody, I don't think we'll have time to do all three of these inside. People have like really strong preferences amongst them. I might not go with your preference, but you know, I might. People feel agnostic, excited about all three. Huge. Okay. I think then we'll actually start with the Maharsha because the Maharsha and the Pnei Yehoshua are focused on the same section of Rashi. And if we have any time, we'll take a look at the Shita Mikubetset. Okay, so this Maharsha is on the Rashi that we just read at the end here, right? That the Seifa, right? You see Rashi where it says Seifa. Does somebody want to read? I read that, but does somebody want to reread it? Maybe Joel, do you want to read the Rashi on Seifa?
Oh, I gotta go back to it. This is the Seifa Shmo'inan. Is that one?
Seifa Delo Efshar Below Tefila. Yeah, sorry, there are multiple Seifas.
Seifa Midikatani Seifa V'chule. Is that the Rashi?
It's Seifa Delo Efshar Below Tefila Amar.
Below that. It's like in the middle of the page.
Hold on, Legula Resha. Seifa. Here we go. Yeah. Seifa Delo Efshar Below Tefila Amar Ani Zachiti Techila Kodem Shnetatia Lach Lo Amar Klum Degali Date Kishinatnalo Netanalo Deadata Dehai Agbaha Veresha Delo Amar Techila Vafilo Hachi Zachava. You want to translate it again too?
I don't think so, but the main thing is that we say, what's this last bit about the Gale Date? What's crucial here?
That he's proving that he initially picked it up for the other guy. That was the whole point.
Right. That like the way Rav Nachman understands it is that he's saying like, yeah, when I hand it over to you, I can't say, well, actually, I had meant to acquire it for myself before, because from the fact that I've handed it to you without saying anything, like I've made clear the fact that, in fact, from the get-go, when I was picking this up and all of this, it was for you, right? So I can't say I actually had acquired it for myself. I'm just handing it to you for safekeeping. I've like revealed my intent that like, you know, I had intended to acquire it for you and I can't change my mind now that it's in your hands. But this explanation is a little weird, as the Maharsha is going to point out. So, Joel, do you want to continue with the Maharsha?
I'm gonna read out of the Maharsha himself in my Gemara just because it's a little bit bigger.
This is in the back if anybody would like.
Although I do have to go in 5 minutes, so let's see if I can do this here. If not, someone will take over. Okay. All right. Befirush Rashi b'dimor matchil seifa de la'afshar v'chulei digale date kishnatano de'adate dehai agbaha v'chulei ad kan l'shana. Okay. Lichora perushot tamua demamo iolo demitchila adata dehai agbaha kivan delefum svara dehashta amabiyem es yalachavro lo kana chavero umatzehu lischot bo kodem hanetina kamo shehu omer zachiti ba kodem shnatati alach. Right. Gam mihi chrichu lezeh deha'ika leferushe b'pshitut keperush Rashi v'nat nitin de'inami knaye kama v'chulei hayahaveni alei b'matana. So, all right, let me try and translate all this now. So initially, this is Perush is a little bit surprising. Not a little bit. This is surprising, right? Because how does it help that, or how is it effective that at the beginning he picked it up for the other person, right? Because we're following the svara right now that someone who picks something up for their friend does not acquire it for their friend, right? And he could have acquired it for himself before giving it to the person, right? Just like says, I acquired it before I gave it to you.
Right. We're in Rav Nachman world right now, right? He's trying to explain the Rav Nachman logic. And nonetheless, he's saying that I keep reversing the actors, but when Rav Joel gave the books to me, it without saying anything before, he's revealed that he initially picked them up on my behalf. Marsha says, who cares? According to Rav Nachman, who cares whether he initially picked them up for me? That could be true. And nonetheless, it's possible that in the intervening time, you decided to acquire them for yourself. Right? And also,
I also like what's forcing Rashi, right, to according to follow where he says he could have just said the same way he did at the beginning in the Mishnah, right? The original Perush of Rashi, where he said, who cares? Let's say the first guy acquires it. Once you give it to the guy, it's a matana. So like, what do you care what happened in the initial stages? Just say, once you gave it to the person, it was a matana, and it doesn't matter.
Right, it's a matana, or it was hefker, and now he acquired it. Like, great. Either way, like Rashi already had a way of explaining why the guy's claim isn't effective in the Seifa, right? So why does he now need to throw in something about like, he is revealed by handing it over that initially he picked it up to this person? That seems totally irrelevant within the Rav Nachman world of 9b-10a chavero kana chavero. But Marsha has some suggested answers.
Should I read the explanation?
Please do.
All right. V'nir elefarish. De adata de hayag baha de kamar. Ein retzono liknot tolo de halo kanalo. Right. So when he says, let me explain. When he says it's he picked it up for the purpose of this guy, right? That when Rashi says that, he doesn't mean that he picked it up to buy, to purchase it, to acquire it. That's the word I'm looking for him, because we know that doesn't work. So what does he mean? Derot selamar adata de hayag baha liten lo b'matana. Right? It meant that he picked it up with the intent to give it as a gift. Right? And this is going to be the important point. Demistama adata dahachi netanalo b'torat matana velo b'torat pikadon. Because how do we, right? We talked about this a little bit. How do we know that when he gave it to the person, that he gave it to him as a gift? Right? Maybe it was just like, hey, can you be my shomer for a while on this thing? Maybe that's what he says, right? And therefore he is zocheh, the first guy for it. So this is proof that it was given as a gift. V'ilav demitchila adata dahachi agbaha liten lazeh lo hayanu lomar shenetano lazel b'matana ela shenetano biado b'torat pikadon kevan demitchila adata didei agbaha mistama adata dahachi netano biado sheyesh shelo v'lo tano lo b'matana v'duk. All right. So he says, right, because if we didn't reveal to us that he had picked this up for the other person, we would say actually from the stam that if you pick something up for yourself and then you give it to somebody else, we're not giving it to matana, you're giving it to watch. That's a stam mina stam pikadon. That's not mina stam matana. And so therefore Rashi is forced to say what he said based on that.
Right. That like Rashi here is actually, according to the Maharsha, he's like building on his previous perush. Right? He's building on the previous perush where at the beginning on our Mishnah he had said, oh, well, Mimana Shach, the person has acquired it because, even if the initial guy had acquired it for himself, it's now given as a matana. He's now saying, well, how do we know? Right? Is there not a third possibility that giving was just like as a pikadon and they never intended it as like a transfer of ownership? And the answer is like, no, since I told Rav Joel to go pick up those books for me. He went, he picked them up, he gave them to me, didn't say anything before they were in my hands. We say it is very clear that his intent to do so, his intent was to give them to me, right? That if his intent was to acquire them for himself and then just like hand them to me for safekeeping, he would have said something, right? If he doesn't say something until they're in my hand, we don't believe him basically to say, really, I had actually acquired them for myself and now I'm just handing them to you as a pikadon. Okay, I think it's a clever read. Right? Like adds in an additional possibility that we hadn't considered from that initial Mimanav Shach Rashi. Maybe it's not a Mimanav Shach, right? Maybe there would be a way of refuting that. So that's why he needs to add this. The Pnei Yehoshua addresses the same issue, but he has his own take. So you're going to pick up, if people see here, the La'aniyut Dati, since up until now, that's basically just summarizing the Kashya and then the answer of the Maharam. The Maharsha and the Maharam explains the same way. Does anybody feel excited about Pnei Yehoshua and want to read? Or feel medium about the Pnei Yehoshua and want to read? Well, maybe Rav Nachum, do you want to start us off, and then if somebody's inspired, we can transfer midway. We're at the La'aniyut Dati Nirin Divrei Rashi.
No, I'd rather somebody else read.
I can call on somebody, but Pnei Yehoshua is very fun. Alish, I think you said something, but you're on mute. Was that about you? You're not volunteering? No?
And I can do it. I haven't seen it, but I can do it.
Excellent.
Okay. לעניות דעתי נראים דברי רש"י נכונים. משום דהכה אליבא דרבי נחמן קיימינן, אוקיי, because we follow רבי נחמן, ורש"י לשיטתו, שכתב בפרק משירין, ביצה, לרבי נחמן דאמר לא קני חברו, מכל שכן דמגביה גופה נמי לא קני והווי כהפקר.
Okay, pause there.
Okay. So in my humble opinion, the Rashi is right, because here it's we follow the logic of Rabbi Nachman, and Rashi is like consistent with his method, because he wrote in the Perek Meshirin that for Rabbi Nachman, when he said Lo kana chavero, mikol sheken, because the one who picks it up, he doesn't acquire it, and it's like hefker.
Right. So this is the dispute we mentioned at the beginning of class, right?
That's why he's not makne for the chavero.
Well, not why, but as in that the Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet say that, within the realm of Bava Metzia l'chavero lo kana chavero, Rav Nachman says, yeah, when Rav Joel picked up those books for me, I didn't acquire them. And all the more so, he didn't acquire them because he wasn't even trying to acquire them for himself. He was trying to acquire them for me, and that failed. He hasn't acquired them for himself either. Rav Nachman says they're just hefker in that case. Right? והטעם
דאף על גב דלפי הדין לא קנה חברו, מכל מקום אנן צעדי שזה הגביה מעיקרה הדעתי דחברי, ולא הדעתה דנפשי, וסופו מוכיח על תחילתו, שנתנה לחברו, מחמת שהיה סובר דהדין הוא דקנה חברו. Okay, I'll stop here. And the reason is that it's part of the fact that, like, we followed the deen, the halacha would be that the friend didn't acquire it. That would be the halacha, but mikol makom, we were witnessing that the one who picked it up, so he did it initially like on the intention of his friend, and he didn't do it for himself. And we can prove it from the end. From the end we can like derive what was his intention in the beginning, and we saw in the end that he gave it to his friend because he thought that he was in fact being makne for his friend when he picked it up.
Joel picked up the books, handed me the shas, thought that was effective, right? He thought that from the moment he picked up the books for me, they were mine. And he's like, well, these are now Lexie's, I'm just going to hand them over. Right?
אבל כשעדיין ביד המגביה, ודאי רבי נחמן גופה מודה דקנה המגביה. כסתם מתניתים, דהכה. Right, but if they are in the hands of the Magbia, so of course that Rabbi Nachman would say that he was acquiring them, like שאם אמר, אני זכיתי בה, זכה בה כשעודנו בידו. Because when he said, like, it's mine, so it's his when it's still in his hands.
Right, that Rav Nachman holds like our Mishnah here, right? That like, if it's still in your hands, you have the ability to acquire it.
ואף על גב דרש"י מפרש אליבא דרבי נחמן, דרב נחמן, דאני זכיתי בה דרישא, היינו שרוצה לזכות בה עכשיו, היינו לרבותא, דאפילו שהוא מודה שהגביה לצורך חברו, אפילו הכי יכול לחזור בו, כיוון דסביר עלי לא קנה חברו. I'll stop here, but in spite of the fact that Rashi explains it according to Rabbi Nachman, that when he says Ani zachiti ba, that the Ani zachiti ba in the ratio of the Mishnah says that he it means that he wanted to be zoche immediately,
or so, like now as opposed to initially.
I'm sorry, now, right, exactly, like now. So Hainu Ravuta, right, it broadens the thing, so it's both initially and now. That's how I
right? Yeah, that again, this is addressing the initial kashya of if we're in Rav Nachman world, why do we need to say that, like, why do we need to have any kind of claim about what the person thought when they initially lifted it, right? Because again, even when they lift it for their friend, it doesn't work and they can change their mind now, right? But this is l'ravuta, which is that even if the Magbia admits that what?
Right? Even if he says, I picked it for my friend, right? And even then, he can say in the moment when he holds it in his hands, I want it for myself, right? Because he thinks that he's not being makne for the friend, like he's aval mikol makom mashma. לכל שכן אם אמר שהגביע תחילה לצורך עצמו, דזוכה בו ונאמן בכך. But in any case, it's clear that if he said, if the Magbia, the one who picked it, like did it initially, and he did it for himself, so we trust him. We trust him that he wanted to. I mean, probably if he says it that he picked it for himself initially, so he's trusted that he did it for himself. Zehu pashut kademashma lehedia minashon Rashi bishmatin bekamuduchte, and it's clear. Because according to the language of Rashi in several places in the Shas. Shall I read on?
Well, is there anybody who feels interested in taking over with the Od? All right, well, keep going, Alish.
Okay. ועוד, דמהיכה תיתי לא יהיה נאמן, כשעודנו בידו, ועינינו רואות שרוצה לקנות בה. So why he shouldn't be trusted when we see the things in his hand, and we see that he wants to acquire it. Umimela knuya ve'omedet etzlo, and like from itself, like how do you translate that? It's acquired and it sits in his hand. Ve'im kach kshe'amar shekana mishat hagbaha nami ne'eman, and if he says initially I intended to pick it up, so he's also believed. אם כן, מכל זה מוכח דכל עיקר דמילתא דרבי נחמן בפירוש משילין דלא כאן המגביה, היינו נמי לאחר שיצא מידו. Okay, so here I get it lost. ואם כן, And if so, it's proven that the beginning of the words of Rabbi Nachman in the Perush B'Meshilin,
or not in Perush, in the Perek Meshilin.
In the Perek Meshilin, right? That's what
where...
we quoted before. That the Magbia is not acquiring it.
But when he says, right, that this was in a case where Magbia Metzia l'Chavero, that not only lo kana Chavero, but the Magbia is also lo kana, that when he says that,
so he didn't acquire it right for both of them.
Nani lachar she'yatza miyado.
Right, when it left his hands. So we cannot say that he acquired, like, probably that's like from the moment when it left his hands. So he cannot claim that it's his.
Right, there's implications. Rav Nachman's position, right, that when you pick up something for your fellow, not only does your fellow not acquire, but neither do you, has implications not only for right now, but also for what happens after that thing had left his hand, right? The Kamash Malan.
וכמה שמלן דרא אמרינן דמסתיו ההווי קאי ברשות המגביה למפרע קודם הנתינה. And it's as we learned that we don't say that it's stam in the ownership of the Magbia, like what we say, like retrospectively, like before he gave it to him. No, it doesn't make sense now with the time. So how does it go?
Yeah,
so
that like
we cannot say that retrospectively, like
right. We don't say that like Rav Joel handed those books to me, and we say actually, they were always his, right? From the get-go, those were always his. And if they were his when he handed them over, im kain.
ואם כן, הנתינה היה מתנה בטעות. So it would be like mistaken מתנה, שהיה סובר שמשעד הגבהה זכה חברו, because he falsely thought that when he picked it up, he acquired it for his friend.
Right, that we might have thought like that this is a scenario where it's a matana, but that matana could basically be canceled because it's on, like, it wasn't intended as a matana. Right? That if the person actually believes that Magbia Metzia Chavira, that does work, and the dean was in fact not only that doesn't work, but that they've acquired it for themselves, then yes, theoretically something you own, you have the ability to give to somebody else as a matana. But Joel wasn't giving it to me as a gift. He was giving it to me because he thought it was already mine. In which case it's not actually a proper matana. So we might have thought, but if that's our stance, right, that this actually, the matana could be canceled because it was essentially on false premises. Right?
Okay, וכמה רבי נחמן דלא אמרינן הכי, אלא מסתמה הגביה עד עתי דחברי. And Rabbi Nachman says we cannot say all that what we said before, but Stam, the one who picks it like on the attention of his friend, ואם כן לא נתכוון לקנותו בעודנו בידו, וכיוון דלא נתכוון לא קנה, והווה כהפקר וקנה חברו במשיכה. So I got it a bit disconnected in my head now. So and if so, he didn't intend to give it to his friend when it's still in his to be acquiring it for him when it's still in his hands, and because he didn't intend, so he didn't acquire it and even for himself, and it's like hefker, and his friend just took it from his hands and he kana b'meshicha.
Right,
So
but
it was hefker the whole time.
But basically, according to the Rav Sheshet stance, he's saying there would be room besides the Maharsha argument of the Pikadon, right? There would also be potential room for canceling it out by saying, if you think that when the Magbia Metzia L'Chavero, not only Lo Kana Chavero, but the Magbia acquires it for themselves, right? Then we have to say that like them giving it over to the other person is a matana, right? That was how Rashi explained it in the initial Rashi. But if the person in that case, if we say they've actually acquired it for themselves, but they don't know that, they think it's the other person's already, then maybe you would say it's a ta'ut, right? That isn't a proper matana because they didn't even think they were giving it as a gift. So the Chiddush of Rav Nachman is that that doesn't matter because the point is that since they picked it up for me, I haven't acquired it, but they haven't acquired it either, right?
Mm-hmm.
Since they picked it up for me, they have not acquired it for themselves. They had no intent to acquire it for themselves. And so it was just hefker, right? And so when I gave it over to them and they picked it up, they acquired it by acquiring hefker, right? And so there's no concern about ta'ut. What matters is that we say, if they picked it up on my command, they didn't say anything otherwise. We assume they picked it up for me. It didn't acquire, like, it didn't acquire it to me automatically, but since they had no intent to acquire it for themselves, it just stays in its status until I pick it from their hand. I think after this point, this very long thing of Yehoshua becomes somewhat repetitive, so we don't need to get deeply into Rav Sheshet. But it's complicated but fun stuff. I think that, like, in some ways it's very in the weeds, but he's like really trying to weave together even just like the Rashis that are bookending this part of the sugya, right? That like they seem in some ways to have certain inherent contradictions, but Yehoshua's job is to defend Rashi. And he says, yeah, like there's a chiddush to explaining why does it matter that the person picked it up for me from the beginning, even though we're in Rav Nachman world and we don't think that affects anything. It matters because it reveals that I was never intending to acquire it for myself, right? And therefore it remained hefker until it was given to the person who had made the request. I realize that was a lot. Do people have particular bits that they're thinking about or stuck on? All right, well, we have a whole 10 minutes, so we actually can look at the Shita Mekubetzet. So I think gives an interesting look back into what we were saying with the Rashi on the top of Yod Amud Aleph, right? The idea of what are the chidushim of our Mishnah? How are we understanding it even just from like like how do we understand the Mishnah in relationship to itself and what it's trying to teach us, even sort of beyond the like Lemaisa halachic level, I think is very interesting. The Shita Mekubetzet I personally think is easier to read than the Pnei Hoshua if anybody is feeling jazzed about Rabbi Tzalel Ashkenazi. And thank you, Alish, for reading some very complicated Pnei Hoshua. Noam, are you feeling jazzed? Michael, I saw you go off mute. Are you feeling jazzed?
Unless Noam wants it particularly, I'm jazzed enough.
All right. Beautiful. Take it away.
Okay. Amar ani zachiti ba v'chulei. Lo matzena lefarushe de'iri ke'perash behadya b'shat hagbaha l'tzorech ploni ani magbia. De'im kain ki dachinan lekaman matnitin de'amar tchila uperash Rashi mitchila higbati l'tzorchi v'lo l'tzorchach heichi mati l'meimar hachi. Velo b'shat hagbaha, velo b'shat hagbaha, Right. So like
Read a little more. Hello b'shat hagba peresh.
Peresh litzorech chaviro.
Okay.
So I can't explain this in accordance with the kind of explicit perush given of saying that this statement, right, like that I wish to acquire it, is said at the time of actually picking it up, that that like you then say at that point, like, I am picking it up for the sake of so and so, my friend.
Right. But like we can't be dealing with the case where as Rav Joel was picking up the books, he was like, I am picking up this shas for my good friend Lexie.
Right.
Because
because if that were the case, when we have the challenge from the Mishnah,
or not from the Mishnah, right? Later on, remember when Ula sort of defends his interpretation by explaining our Mishnah.
Okay. Right, when we have this challenge later from Ula saying that the Mishnah is saying it's in the case where Joel makes this claim like at the beginning when he goes to pick up the object.
Or that Amar Tchila and Perish Rashi, how does Rashi explain Amar Tchila?
Rashi explains it as this concept of like saying, or right, for Rashi, it's that you kind of retroject it back, saying that, oh, when I initially picked it up, I was picking it up for myself, not for Lexie.
Right. And so if he had actually, when he first picked it up, been saying, I am picking up this shas for Lexie, what's the problem?
Then like how could you say that you can't have a case where you're both picking it up saying I'm picking it up for myself and where I'm saying I'm picking it up for Lexie at the same moment.
Right. We simply wouldn't believe him, right? If he had initially said, I picked this up for Lexie, and later he's like, actually, it's mine. And what I mean is that when I first picked it up, it was for myself. Of course, we're not going to believe him. He explicitly made a, statement to the contrary.
Right.
Right. So I think we can, the sphere bit is just getting slightly repetitive, but he was explaining, definitely the guy picking it up is not saying at the time, I'm doing this for my buddy on the horse, right? So at the end of the line, Ella.
End of the line, Ella. Okay. Ella vadai hachi perusho. Ki v'shat hagbaha lo peirash. V'hashta peirash mitzchila zachiti balatzorchi. Rather, this must be what it's saying, right? That at the time, right, that it's not referring to the time at which one picked up the object, but rather that it's saying that kind of now in the moment,
or I
later.
would say the Shad talk about low perish, I think it's that at the time of the lifting, the person didn't explicate their intent. Right?
Right. That like now later they're coming and making the claim saying that, oh, back then when I picked it up, I intended to pick it up for my own desire. For
exactly.
my own
and if this is the case,
V'im kain kasha
tuva.
Kasha tuva. Right, like and if so, that's there's a bunch of problems. There's a big problem. Mila memra v'chi misha omer l'chaviro ten li metzia zo v'higbia ota l'tzorech atzmo tzricha le latana lememar dekana hazocha. Right, like what is this saying, right? If a person says to their friend, right, give me this object, and the friend picks up the object for their own sake, does the Tana need to say that that person who picked it up is the one who acquires it?
Right, like this is what we mentioned earlier of like, according to Ula, where Rav Joel tells me that like from the get-go, he had picked up those books for himself. Shita that they're his. Like, okay, great. He picked them up for himself. They're his. Why would that need to be taught? What is the chiddush of the Mishnah? Of course, then they're his. Right? And so now, Kushya Zo.
The Kushya Zo dechakte l'Rav Nachman, farushe matnitin deha dekatane ani zachiti ba, ani rotzel zachot ba achshav. Af al pi de'ein halashon v'ha'inyan mitparesh yafe l'dato. And this difficulty is a challenge to Rav Nachman.
It's what forced Rav Nachman.
Rav Nachman forced Rav Nachman to understand or to interpret the Mishnah as saying that it's a case of this of this one who says that like I. Right. So to say that the person who is saying ani zachiti ba is saying, right, I now, like later on in the process, wish to acquire the object, even though the language and the situation don't so easily lend themselves to that interpretation.
Right. The Shita Mekubetza is explaining a little bit of what we mentioned earlier, which is like, what compels Rav Nachman to his explanation of the Mishnah? Now, I think one thing that compels him is, as we'll see in the continuation of the sugya, that he in general believes Bava Metzia lechavero lo kana chavero, right? But also, the Shita Mekubetza is saying he was bothered by this idea of, according to the Ula explanation, if we think that the person is saying, I lifted this for myself from the get-go, that's just so pshita that doesn't, why would the Mishnah bother teaching it? Yeah. So that's why Rav Nachman feels the need to explain it as, oh, what I meant is I initially picked it up for them and now I'm acquiring it, even though the language of ani zachiti ba doesn't really, the pshat of that seems to be I acquired it, not
in the past.
Not like I am now getting it for myself. But like, he explains it that way because otherwise he has the difficulty of what's the chiddush. Yesh tzaretz, maybe there's a chiddush.
Yesh tzaretz deha kamash malan. Desalka data chamina. Kevan de amarlo tneli ve ani hamehafpech becharera uva acher untala mimenu nikra rasha vehu higbia stam. V'lo peirash b'shat hagbaha litzorchi ani magbia. Mistama litzorech chaviro higbia. V'lo neminhu b'masha omer ata mitchila higbati litzorchi. Kamash malan d'ne'aman. V'lo nikra rasha kivan shehi metzia d'lo matzinan lemei marlei. Okay,
so pause there. It's still going, but there's a lot.
We could answer that this is what it's saying, but lest you come to think that since the person, I think, on the horse said to him on the ground, like, give it to me.
Right. And then this next bit is a quote from Kiddushin. Did anyone like the Ani hamehapech b'charera? That basically we say
turning over. No.
This is like a loaf of bread, right? That a poor person basically is in the process of trying to acquire a loaf of bread and somebody else like comes and grabs it. If an ani is like, processing bread, trying to acquire it, and some other person comes and snatches it. Rabbi Abba says, Nikra Rasha.
That person is called a Rasha for taking it from the ani.
Right, even though it's not theft, right?
Right.
Like the
Who
ani
would be a
hadn't
stum, right? Like the if the ani, I guess, hasn't acquired it yet, then it's just hagbaha, right? Like
Or-
legally speaking.
the higbia stam, I think, is bringing us back to our Mishnah, right? But
Ah.
that there, the ani hadn't, I think, done hagba at all, right? So it's not his yet, but we still said, because he's clearly trying to acquire it for himself, you coming and taking it makes you a crappy person, right? Like, and so since we say that, and in this case in our Mishnah, the person who picked it up, higbia stam, right, just picked it up below pirish and didn't explain what.
Didn't explain at the time of picking it up that they were picking it up for their own sake. The stum assumption is that they're picking it up for the other person. And therefore they're not believed when they say later on, well, originally I was picking it up for my own sake.
Right. So that's all what I might have thought. So then the Mishnah teaches us.
Right. Come on. Right. Which so the Mishnah teaches us this to say that the person is believed and is not referred to as a Rasha when they kind of do that, when they make that retrojective statement. Right. Like, since this is an object where we are not able to say to him that you should just go get another one.
Right. It's like you might not come on another Metzia.
Sorry?
You might not come upon another Metzia, right? Like you can't guarantee that that's going to exist.
Right. Is that referring back to the, no, we're not
That's
referring
here. We're not referring to the ani. The ani, we're still like, you're a bad person.
Right. You're a Rasha there. Okay. Right. But for this, you wouldn't necessarily, right. You wouldn't say like, no, you just go find another Metzia. Obviously there's two beautiful shasas lying around the streets of Jerusalem.
I mean, honestly, there might.
I mean,
be,
if it's going to be anywhere,
you can't guarantee it, right?
Right. Right. If it's going to be anywhere, it's going to be there. But I wouldn't bank on it. Right. Umasha lo perash b'shat agbaha memar amar kevan shadavar hu biadi lama afaresh stamo keperashti kol mi she'er alai omer betchila litzorchi hagbatiha. And that which is not explicated or said explicitly at the time of actually lifting the object, it's said about it, right, that since the object was not in, since the object is in my hand, why should I let it go? Like, why should I separate it from
Or also, I think more, why do I need to explain? It's in my hand right now. I don't need, like, I'm currently in possession of it.
I don't need to tell anyone why I picked it up. No one's question, right? Like if I pick up an object from the ground, no one's like, well, is it yours?
I'm like cradling this shas on my hip, you know? And if somebody challenges me.
Right. Then right. The assumption is it's yours. And the assumption of the case is as I have explained, everyone who she are air ally.
That this is the person saying, if people raise challenges against me, then I'll explain.
Whoever is challenging me, I can just say I picked it up for my own sake from the very beginning, right? Which is why I now have possession of it.
And I think since apologies that we're already over time, the last bit is basically just saying Rav Nachman has more flexibility with the Mishnah than Ula does. But I think it's a clever hop. It's like similar to what I think we had talked about a little bit when finishing the Gemara, but that the chiddush for Ula is that, yeah, like you really might have thought that since I asked Joel to go do that, he did it, didn't say anything, like, are we really gonna believe him to say, like, maybe we wouldn't believe him to say that he did it for his own sake. Maybe like that would make him a bad person, and we don't believe that like people engage in that. We say, no. Like when he says, while still holding on to it, I picked it up for myself, despite the fact that like you might have thought there were indicators to the contrary, we believe him, right? He picked it up, he's still holding it. He's able to claim that he did that for himself. And we both like don't think that makes him a terrible person, and we believe that that's true, and he's acquired it, right? So that's the Ula Chiddush. According to Rav Nachman, again, the Chiddush is that when you pick up something for yourself and someone else, then it works. But if you pick up something just for yourself, just for somebody else, it doesn't. Okay. Next week, shkoyach, major shkoyach, especially to all of you, and especially Alish and Michael for reading some tricky stuff. Next week, I'll send out fuller sources, but minimally we're going to continue until the next Mishnah. We'll get into some of the whys of behind the Bava Metzia l'chavero logic and why it might not work, which we saw a little hint of in a Rashi way back on Chet Amud Aleph. So they'll bring back fun memories. And
is it safe to assume that next week is 2 weeks from now?
Do we have Shir next week?
Because of Yom Ha'atzmaut, you're saying?
Yeah, right. In the US, it will still be the afternoon of Yom HaZikaron, but in Jerusalem, it will be the beginning of Yom HaAtzmaut.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yom Ha'atzmaut evening at 9:00. Yeah, I guess we won't have class. Actually, you're right. I did notice it on the calendar, and I was thinking, well, maybe it's okay, but maybe it's not okay.
I mean, I'll be in Berlin. I'm happy to teach, but